Something like that, I guess. I'm not going to stand up on the podium. I don't have slides. This is strictly impromptu. I didn't realize that, in fact, well, I've been vaguely suspecting for 1 or 2 releases now that somehow where I thought we were headed with release notes was not, in fact, where the releases were headed, and that at least some communication had gotten lost somewhere along the way. So what I want to do is tell my story of involvement with the release notes with an eye to explaining with that story why I think this is an issue for the room as a whole to think about and consider for future involvement. So I started contributing to this Kubernetes documentation sometime in the summer of 2017. And in late August, early September, I became aware that the release team was working on release notes in a somewhat different way. Up through release 1.7, and Andrew can correct me because he was the docsmeister for that release, but my understanding is that up through 1.7, the release lead had been responsible for shepherding the release notes through to publication. And it had been a chaotic, last-minute, painful wrangling. Nobody was very happy with the output. And so I went back and looked up in my Slack history. Caleb Miles came up with the idea that there be someone actually assigned to responsibility for release notes separately and individually with release 1.8. Well, Caleb's not a technical writer, and he had Radhika Nair on his team, and she became involved with the release notes around the same time that I became aware of this need. And so we had this kind of informal agreement that Radhika and I would work together on the release notes. Also, for the first time in 1.8, we didn't use the process that some of you may be familiar with now, whereby the release notes are pulled out of the strings in the code pull requests, dumped into a Google Doc, massaged there, and then eventually dumped back into a Markdown file in GitHub. Instead, we were working from a raw Markdown file, and all the release notes were generated for the first time there. Sometimes that involved release contributors copy-pasting what they put in pull requests. Often it involved that, but there was no automation. It was an entirely manual process. And Radhika and I sort of team-tagged editing that Markdown file. And we spent 12-hour days the last week of the release getting it cleaned up for release. It was actually kind of fun. I mean, it was a substantial, well-bounded sort of set of tasks. And there was a lot of very clear, obvious work to clean all of those release notes up so that they made sense and provided useful information. For 1.9, I was the release notes lead. It was a kind of obvious extension of this last-minute informal engagement that I was part of. And only part of. I stress that this was really a kind of collective effort for 1.8. For 1.9, I was the release notes lead. And I believe 1.9 was the first time we tried for the Google Doc approach, because the problem with the Markdown file is you can't do real-time collaborative editing. We weren't importing from the pull request, however, so it was still a manual file, but it was a Google Doc. We could do real-time collaborative editing and then convert that to Markdown right at the very end. That piece of the process is still in place, so that much we have. Nick Chase was my shadow for 1.9, and with 1.10, he started automating parts of this process. And at this point, it seems as after 1.10, I'm not really clear how this happened, but the release notes process has drifted further and further away from SIG Docs involvement. And so now the approach is this automated dumping of the strings from the pull request into the Google Doc. Some editing there of individual release notes in the Google Doc, but most of the extra work that's done in the Google Doc, if I'm understanding it correctly, is the addition of the SIG-based themes. That was an innovation for 1.8 also. There had been release themes before that, we didn't really have a release theme for 1.8. It was supposed to be a maintenance release. Remember when maintenance releases in Kubernetes were a thing, which they aren't anymore? Well, they never really were, right? But they were a fiction that was maintained until it was finally abandoned. But anyway, that content is added. And I guess, at least with 1.13, it seems to me like I've seen that there's like a release theme, and people are talking about release themes for 1.14 too, and for all of 2019 for that matter. So that stuff's changing too, and that all affects release note work because that's where that content gets dumped, right? But it's manual content, it comes in last. It kind of doesn't matter at the end of the day whether it's overarching release themes or if it's SIG-based themes. It's content that needs wrangling at the last minute when somebody who's not a writer is responsible for saying, okay, here's what we're actually going to say about the release. But somewhere along the way, the idea that somebody who is really primarily responsible for making sure that individual release notes make intelligible sense to someone who's not the person who wrote them in the first place, or maybe even the person who wrote them in the first place, seems to have gotten a bit lost. It's a little, not a lot, but a little like the other things that have happened in SIG Docs in 2018, where we've gotten so concerned. We've done a lot of amazing work with tooling and process and infrastructure at the expense of sufficient attention to content. Now, that's not to say that was a bad idea. I think it's a good idea. But the time has come, I think, to turn our attention to content again. And I would really like to see SIG Docs sort of do what I see given my history with it, return to engagement with release notes. I have some ideas about how to do that, but I think I'll shut up and ask for questions and see whether we can turn this into a little piece of a group discussion. We've agreed this isn't going to be a Q1 project or task, but if anybody in the room is interested in talking a little bit more about it, I think we have a few minutes to. So, Jack, you were involved with some of this, right?
Well, the thing is, like Nick Chase was the release lead for release notes during my release. I don't think we said a word to each other because I didn't know that that was a documentation-based task. I joined the process after, my first release was 1.11.
Right, right.
So actually hearing the history of this, I'm like, oh, well, I guess it makes sense why it hasn't had a huge focus on content and writing. It's because it hasn't been a SIG Docs task. It's been an automation task. So it's probably a really smooth process.
Right. It's gotten a lot better, but it's.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's had the love and attention from the brilliant minds in this place who have a command of the English language I could only have in my dreams.
You just did pretty darn well, so.
Wait till my fingers get on the keyboard. To your point, I agree that it could use some love. Should it be one of those things where that release person is kind of like, in some ways, responsible for reporting back to SIG Docs, or that they collaborate with the release lead from SIG Docs? Like Docs release and SIG release are not the same person, but they work closely together?
I think that wouldn't be a bad thing.
Okay.
I think at least having the release notes lead, report into SIG Docs, not necessarily every week, but regularly and maybe more frequently toward the end of the release would be good. I'd love to see, and I don't know how to make this happen, right? I can think of ways to try to help improve the quality of the original release note content. I did actually get merged one PR to provide a little bit more guidance about how to write a release note in the PR itself. That's about all I ever actually succeeded in implementing in terms of interaction with dev. And I've had it in mind to provide more guidance. But part of the problem, and I think automation has fixed some of this, but part of the problem is that the default requirement is still that you provide a release note with every pull request. And you've got to add the release note none label and get that approved. But there are lots of things that wind up with release notes that really don't need them. Now, one of the things automation has done, I think, and I need to go in and look better at this if I'm going to be involved in a fix going forward. One of the things I think automation has helped is there's better sorting of release notes now. So you don't have obscure low-level bug fixes mixed in with, oh, here's a new feature. Yeah. So I think that the kind of the kind of critter a release note refers to, that stuff's better sorted now, and that's a huge improvement. But the actual content of the individual release notes, at least in draft form, is still low.
So what would be a good time to check in with them as far as the release cycle? Like at the beginning, middle, and end, or like towards the end?
At a minimum, I think beginning, middle, and end. I mean, PRs wind up getting cherry-picked, sort of throughout the release cycle, right? So I think it's never too early to try to assess the state of, whatever's currently there.
The majority would be at the end.
Well, yes, because,
Not so much at the beginning.
right.
All the themes from the SIGs come in at the end.
Oh, yeah, the themes come in all at the end. But I'm thinking more in terms of individual PR release notes, right? That's where I see, I do think we should have editorialize on those SIG written themes and have that be a more systematic thing. And I think that one's pretty simple to do. It's the individual PR release notes that are a harder nut to crack, I think.
So, just to plus one what Zach said earlier about the, so I released my cert for 1.9 and a little bit for 1.11, and there were on the release notes versus the release meister for the docs. Those roles were almost completely opaque to each other.
Yep.
So, I guess I have a two-part question.
Yeah, turn
One
this off.
is, do you think that release notes that we should, do you think that we should include a release notes meister as part of the docs release team? And if so, what are the requirements for that role? Should we bias for someone with more editorial command or more automation and technical command?
Well, there is a release notes meister as a member of the release notes team, as a member of the release team now, right? That exists. But the staffing of that has drifted away from being a docs person. And putting two people on it seems like, well, that would be lovely, but it's an open source project. That's probably overkill. That said, it might be good if, for 114 anyway, okay, that's Q1, maybe 115. At some point in 2019, just because I'm the one who seems to have had the most sort of editorial hand with the release note process, get together with the folks who've done more with the tooling and automation and see whether we can sort of figure out where the points of intersection historically might have been, where we lost them, and where we might put them back together going forward.
Jennifer, you might want to do this with the mic because this is being recorded, so in case other people.
Then I should hand it around too, right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So do we want to own this or not? The release?
Release notes?
Well, we would probably need to SIG release to even have that discussion.
Yeah.
So you want me to talk to the mic?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think at the very least for 114, what I'm hearing around the room is it wouldn't hurt to check in at the beginning of the release, in the middle of the release, at the end of the release, and just say, hey, I'm Jim Angel, we're doing docs, and let's talk for this release. It doesn't sound like it's going to solve any immediate problems today, but at least it's going to open the communication. As Zach said, there's no communication to begin with, so I think opening up that door, and then in Q2 for 115, maybe improving that process. So I've kind of made some notes here for 114. At the very least, just opening that door for communication, I think, would be the first step for me.
The other thing that I've had running on a background thread for about a year now, that it's going to stay there for the foreseeable future, but that maybe can emerge on somebody else's, sort of primary process, is better release note training.
This is a 2-minute warning, just so you know.
Cool.
Is that for contributors?
Yes. Better content in the PR template, and in my dreams, part of better training generally for especially dev contributors to the docs.
Sorry, everyone. I was just going to throw in my 2 cents for how we kind of manage this from, in terms of the communications lead for the release team, is I always sit on, not to say this is necessarily the best way to do it, but I always sit on the release team either as the lead or as the shadow for communications, essentially as the gatekeeper to the blog, since we have to access that, and that has worked really well for us, communications and coordination-wise. So just wanted to throw that out there for some insight to how we do that.
So do you see that as a potential model for the release note role?
If someone from Docs just wanted to sit as the shadow for release notes each time, it doesn't have to be the same person. I mean, it's a lot of overhead. You still have to have the bandwidth, but it's worked really well for us to have that coordination.
Jennifer, thank you. All right, we have just a few minutes left in our scheduled time. Is there anything that folks that we haven't discussed yet today in any format that folks would like to bring up and discuss in like the 6 minutes we have left? We all looked pretty cooked. So, all right, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to, as soon as this is done, as soon as I fly back to Portland, I'm out for like a month. So I'm going to wish you all the happiest of holidays and say again, what a joy and a pleasure and a privilege it's been to work with you over the past year, and I'm looking forward to the year to come. So thank you for everything that you do. This is a really amazing SIG. We have a reputation as being one of the best SIGs to work in Kubernetes, and it is because of all of us together that's true. So thank you, happy holidays, keep rocking it.